All right, welcome back, everybody. Special counsel Jack Smith is urging the Supreme Court to reject former President Donald Trump's assertion that he should have absolute immunity in his D.C. election interference case. In a new filing, Smith insisting the framers of the Constitution, they never intended for presidents to have what is, in essence, a get-out-of-jail-free card. He also dismissed the idea that unless a statute expressly names the president, it does not apply to him. Smith writes this: that radical suggestion, which would free the president from virtually all criminal law, even crimes such as bribery, murder, treason, and sedition, is unfounded. I want to bring in Jonathan Lemire, Politico White House bureau chief, host of MSNBC's Way Too Early, and an MSNBC political analyst. And Danny Cevallos is a criminal defense attorney and an MSNBC legal analyst. Danny, if you will start things off for us, because you have 66 pages, essentially, in this filing, in which Jack Smith says that Donald Trump is not above the law and he should be prosecuted for the crimes in which he is alleged in this indictment. What was your kind of takeaway from that filing?
That Jack Smith has a main argument, but he also has a fallback argument, which I think is probably the more effective one. And here's how it goes. Basically, Smith argues that there is no absolute immunity. And I think the word absolute is key. He's saying essentially that what Trump argues, that Trumps are absolutely always in every instance immune for things that are done while president, is not true. But he adds, and this is part two, even if there is some degree of immunity, which, by the way, I don't think Jack Smith disputes, but he's smart not to raise that here. Even if there is immunity, it doesn't apply under these facts. And it's that second argument that I think is probably going to end up being the most effective. It's a fallback argument, so that even if the court determines, well, there is not absolute always immunity, but there is some degree of presidential immunity, then you go to Jack Smith's second argument, which is, yes, even if there is, it's just not these particular facts. And then there's really a third argument, which is addressing that whole impeachment, acquittal, therefore double jeopardy argument, which at this point is just getting lugged around like a dead weight. And I wonder if the defendants even wish they still had this argument, because it's basically silly.
I'm glad you actually brought that moment up. And we have kind of a paraphrased area in which he wrote about that. And I want to read it for folks to understand. Even assuming that a former president is entitled to some immunity for official acts, that immunity should not be held to bar this prosecution. You feel, Danny, from what I'm hearing from you, that this argument that Smith is actually making in this filing is what may ultimately resonate with the Supreme Court justices when hearing this immunity.
Yes, and I think the one thing that the filing really does well is avoid the issue of having to admit that, yeah, there has to be some presidential immunity in some circumstances. I give a simple example. Presidents who have been involved in military actions, war, something like that, arguably it would just take one county prosecutor to say, hey, you know, someone from our town died in that war. I'm going to prosecute this president. I think that Jack Smith would say, well, that might be an instance where immunity applies, but he can't say that. Instead, he doesn't have to. He just goes to Trump's argument, which is, I'm absolutely always immune for everything that a president ever does while in office. That is an easy argument to attack. But even if the court says, well, there are some circumstances where immunity has to attach, maybe my example as just a silly example, but if so, then you go to the fallback argument, which I think is a very smart way of arguing, saying, hey, even if there is immunity, it's not immunity under these facts, because, as he correctly points out, there are different levels at which a president's power is at its peak and then at what it's called is its lowest ebb. And it depends on the conduct that the president is engaging in.
It's as if you prepared for this segment, Danny Cevallos, because you brought me to my next point. Jonathan Lemire, I want to bring you into the conversation here, and that is immunity. In what way immunity applies to what acts, right, for a president does immunity actually apply? And I want to go back to a moment in which Donald Trump, in a rally in January, talks about immunity and what presidents should be immune from, and he specifically cites an act of war. Let's listen.
This isn't just me. This is all presidents. They have to be given immunity. Otherwise, they're going to be unable to act. Anything they do, if it goes wrong, even if it goes right, the opposing party, and you see that now, where you have these people, they're crazy. They're absolute. The opposing party will indict them for anything they do. Take a look at Harry Truman. He wouldn't have done, if you think Hiroshima, Not exactly a nice act, but it did end the Second World War, probably. Right? Nagasaki, he wouldn't be doing that. He said, I don't want to do that because my opponents will indict me. You have to give a president full and total immunity.
One, Jonathan Lemire, does not equal the other.
No, no question. And this is to Danny's point. There are official acts that a president partakes in, and that act of war, whether it be something like dropping an atomic bomb or a drone strike or whatever it might be, where someone could argue that president would need immunity. That's official conduct. What Donald Trump, though, is being accused of doing, Jack Smith is arguing, first of all, not necessarily official business. This is a campaign, not as president, but also clearly this is not furthering any sort of national security issue. This is someone who is trying to just keep in power himself. So these are very, very different things. And it's a grasping at straws for Trump. And more than anything, whether or not his lawyers even believe this or Trump himself believes it, as a good faith argument, what it really is a stall tactic. And to that point, it has worked because it has gone to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to hear oral arguments in a couple of weeks. There'll be time before it makes a decision, and it jeopardizes whether or not this trial can actually happen before the election.
Yeah, last year when we were talking about this, or a couple of months ago as we were talking about this, we thought this was the one that was going to actually go to trial. And in fact, it's not, and may likely not even go to trial before the election. Jonathan, we have a group of retired military leaders following this amicus brief in support of Jack Smith on Monday. These are four-star generals and admirals and former defense officials as well, saying if Trump's immunity claims are upheld, it would be a threat to democracy and the military chain of command. Former Army Secretary Luis Caldera spoke with Jen Psaki. Let's take a listen.
A president who is intent on violating the law because he's not subject to criminal prosecution would put the military officers and soldiers, the troops, in a position to do things that are unlawful for which they could be prosecuted. The only way that civilian and military leadership works together is if there's fundamental trust between the civilian and military leaders. But if you have a president who's intent to use the military for unlawful purposes, you've destroyed that unity that exists.
What do you make of this move, Jonathan, from military leadership? We certainly know, though, that obviously the Supreme Court, during its hearing of oral arguments, would not necessarily take that into account. This is more of a public plea, in a way.
Yeah, that's right. First of all, to connect it to our previous conversation, these are people who certainly know an official act. You know, there are moments where a president would need immunity in the conduct of war. These are the people, these are the officers who would be carrying out those orders. But really, it is far more important than even that. They're suggesting that if a president had total immunity, he or she could behave with such reckless abandon, perhaps even order unlawfully conduct into combat, that would jeopardize the entire democracy and the American experiment. And certainly we have heard now from a number of decorated generals and admirals, from a number of retired secretaries of defense, from retired Pentagon leaders, from members of Trump's own cabinet, really respected, prestigious men and women who have said, and many of whom who served closely with Trump and watched him day in and day out, who say this man is unfit for office. This man not only should be, in this case, potentially prosecuted, or at least stand to face charges, but someone who would not be worthy of holding the presidency again. And that does add up when you start hearing all of these people who know him best, who argue that he's a clear and present danger to national security. The question is, will enough voters hear it?
Jonathan Lemire, thank you. Danny Ceballos, thank you.
Hey, everyone. MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.